Spring 1885. In the dust-choked square of a frontier town, a blind woman stands on an auction block, a rope halter around her wrist. Her price, $2. No one bids. Then a shepherd steps forward, his offer not of coin, but a quiet question to the crowd: what's wrong with her? Her blindness made her worthless to a town that traded in labor. But the shepherd, named Caleb, saw something else, a quiet dignity others missed. This is the true story of a brutal practice called wife selling, and the one man who defied it not with protest, but with a simple, terrifying offer to take the unwanted. What he didn't know was that she held a secret far greater than her sight. What unfolded in that square wasn't just cruelty, it was a common, brutal transaction. For centuries in England, and carried to the frontier, a man could end his marriage by leading his wife to market with a rope halter around her neck or wrist. The public auction made it real, a twisted theater where everyone played their part. The woman's name was Ilara. She was 24. Her blindness came not from birth, but from a fever at 16, a sickness that took her sight and, in the eyes of her family, her value. For years she was cared for, until the debts mounted and her father's new wife saw only a burden. The halter placed on her wrist that morning was made of rough hemp. It wasn't meant to hurt, but to symbolize a transfer of property, like a horse or a plow. Caleb the shepherd was 32. His own story was written in the lines on his face and the empty space beside him. His wife Sarah had died 2 years prior in childbirth, taking the infant with her. He was left with 5 children under 10, a flock of sheep, and a silence in his cabin so deep it felt like another presence. He came to town for nails and flour, not for a wife, but he saw the halter. He saw the men looking at her not as a person, but as damaged goods, debating her capacity for work. And he saw her face, not fearful, but resigned, as if she had expected nothing better from the world. The auctioneer, a man named Briggs with a ledger, listed her attributes as if cataloging furniture. Can mend clothes, doesn't eat much, quiet. Her blindness was the final, definitive mark against her. Bids were supposed to start at $5. No one spoke. Briggs dropped it to 3, then to 2. A man in the back spat and said, "A blind wife's worse than no wife at all. She'll wander into a ravine or burn your house down." Laughter, thin and nervous, trickled through the crowd. That's when Caleb stepped forward. His voice was low, graveled by wind and isolation. $2, not a bid, but a statement. Briggs blinked. "You heard the man, she can't see." Caleb didn't look at him, he looked at Ilara. "I have $2. The coins, warm from his palm, hit the wooden table with a soft click. The transaction was over in a breath. Her father, looking relieved and ashamed all at once, untied the halter from the post and placed the coiled rope in Caleb's hand. He did not look at his daughter. Caleb did not put the halter on her. He slipped it into his coat pocket. He simply said, "My wagon is there," and he turned. Ilara, guided by the memory of the sun's warmth on her face and the sound of his retreating footsteps, followed. The crowd parted, their murmurs a wave she walked through. She heard one woman whisper, "Poor man, what can he possibly do with her?" That question hung in the air, more tangible than the dust. The wagon was old, the bench worn smooth. He helped her up, his hand under her elbow firm but not forceful. As they rolled out of town, the sounds of commerce faded, replaced by the creak of wheels and the sigh of the prairie wind. He spoke only once. "It's a long ride. There's water in the canteen." She drank. The water tasted of metal and sky. She knew the stories of wife selling. Some women found better men, many found worse. Her fate was now tied to a stranger whose kindness felt like a fragile, terrifying thing. He had bought a problem. She knew that. What she didn't know was that his cabin sat at the edge of a high meadow, that 5 pairs of young eyes were watching the lane, that the silence there was a weight he could no longer carry alone. And he, driving the wagon, felt the weight of the rope in his pocket. He hadn't planned this. He had 5 mouths to feed, sheep to tend, and a heart still sore. He glanced at her profile against the setting sun. She held herself utterly still, as if moving might break some unseen spell. He wondered, with a sudden, cold clarity, what he had actually just done. Had he saved her or doomed them both? The first star appeared as the wagon topped a rise. Below, in a shallow valley, a single light glimmered in the window of a small, leaning cabin. The children were there, waiting. He had told them nothing. Ilara, sensing the halt of the wagon, the change in the air, turned her head slightly. "Are we there?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Caleb took a long, slow breath. "Yes," he said, But in his mind, the real question echoed, unanswered and growing louder with every second. What have I brought home? The cabin door opened to a wall of silence. 5 children, from 10-year-old Jacob down to 4-year-old Ruth, stood frozen in the firelight, staring at the blind woman their father had brought home. Caleb's introduction was a single strained sentence. "This is Ilara, she'll be staying." And in that moment, not a single soul in the room, Caleb included, knew what staying actually meant. The first days were a symphony of accidents. Ilara, navigating by memory and touch, knocked over a water bucket. She misjudged the heat of the stove, burning the morning porridge into a black, smoking crust. She tried to mend a shirt and pricked her fingers until the fabric was dotted with blood. The children watched her with a confusion that bordered on fear. Jacob, the eldest, took to following her, a silent, suspicious shadow, ready to right a toppling chair or steer her away from the hearth. She heard his small sighs, the unspoken question, "What use are you?" Caleb said nothing about the mistakes. He would simply clean the spilled water, scrape the pot, and hand her a fresh needle. His silence was not kindness, but a deep, weary practicality. He had made a decision. He would live with its consequences. At night, Ilara lay in the narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, listening to the wind and the distant bleat of sheep. The rope halter was coiled on a shelf where Caleb had placed it. She knew it was there. It felt less like a symbol of ownership now and more like a question mark. What was she now? Not a daughter, not a wife, a burden purchased for $2. Her world was darkness, but it was a darkness filled with sound and texture. She learned the cabin by its creaks, the third step that groaned, the kitchen board that squealed underfoot. She learned the children by their breath and their footsteps, Ruth's light, skipping patter, Jacob's slow, deliberate tread. She began to listen past their words to what lay beneath. She heard the loneliness in their play, the hollow space where a mother's voice should have been. The first crack in the ice came from Ruth. The little girl, curious and less guarded than her brothers, left a wooden doll on the floor. Ilara's foot found it, sending her stumbling. Instead of scolding, Ilara knelt, felt for the doll and found its carved face. "She's beautiful," Ilara said softly. Ruth, who had been holding her breath, crept closer. "Her name is Mary." "Hello, Mary," Ilara whispered, and for the first time she smiled in that house. Ruth did not take the doll back. She left it in Ilara's hands. Then came the cough. It started with the middle boy, Samuel, a deep rattling sound in the night. By morning he was feverish. Caleb's face was grim. The last fever had taken his wife. He prepared to ride for the doctor, a journey of half a day. Ilara, standing by the wash basin, felt the panic in the room thicken the air. She spoke before she thought. "Let me try." Caleb paused, his hand on the door latch. "Try what?" "My mother, before the fever took my sight, she was a healer. She taught me plants by smell and touch. I remember, mint for fever, pine resin and honey for the cough, please." Jacob scoffed. "She can't even see the stove." Caleb looked from his shivering son to Ilara's sightless, determined face. He made a choice. He nodded. "Show me what you need." She directed him with a startling clarity. "Strip the bark from the young willow there. The mint grows by the creek bed. It smells like clean water." She felt each leaf he brought her, crushed them between her fingers, inhaled their scent to confirm. She boiled water, her hands moving cautiously but surely over the familiar shapes of pot and ladle. She made a poultice, guided by memory in her fingertips, and placed it on Samuel's small chest. She sat by his side all night, her hand on his forehead, humming a tune her own mother had hummed. By dawn, the fever broke. Samuel's breathing eased into the soft rhythm of sleep. Caleb, who had not slept either, stood in the doorway. He watched Ilara's head nod with exhaustion, her hand still resting on his son's brow. The rigid line of his shoulders softened, just a fraction. He did not thank her. He brought her a cup of bitter, black coffee and set it on the stool beside her. The gesture was worth more than words. Something shifted in the cabin. The children didn't see a blind woman anymore. They saw the woman who had made Samuel better. They began to bring her things, a smooth rock, a feather. Ruth would take her hand and guide it to a drawing she'd made in the dirt by the door. Ilara would trace the lines and guess. "Is it a sheep?" Ruth's giggle was the sound of a lock turning. But the outside world had not changed. A week later, Caleb needed supplies. Reluctantly, he brought Ilara to town. He helped her down from the wagon, and the whispers began immediately. They moved through the market like a cold current. "That's the blind one Thatcher bought. Looks lost already. A shameful business." Ilara held her head high, her hand lightly on Caleb's arm, but she felt every stare like a physical touch. Then a voice cut through the murmur, sharp and familiar. It was her stepmother, Agnes, standing by the dry goods stall with a neighbor. "Well, he hasn't returned you yet, I see. I suppose even a blind hen finds a speck of grain sometimes." The neighbor tittered. Ilara froze, the old shame rising like bile. Caleb stopped. He had been counting nails into a sack. He turned slowly. He looked not at the women, but at Ilara's face, at the slight tremble in her chin she was fighting to control. Then he spoke, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the sudden quiet of the street. "She found more than a speck," he said. "She found 4 children who don't cough at night anymore. She found a home that doesn't feel empty. And I found a woman who can see what's important better than most folks, with 2 working eyes." He took Ilara's hand and placed it back in the crook of his arm. "We are done here." They walked back to the wagon, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. In that moment, the $2 transaction, the halter, the auction block, it all fell away. He had not defended a purchase. He had defended a person. Ilara did not cry until they were on the road home, and even then, they were quiet tears of a pain she hadn't known she was still carrying, finally washing away. That night, for the first time, Jacob called her not her or Ilara, but ma'am. It was a small word, awkward and formal, but it was an offering. She accepted it with a nod he couldn't see, but somehow understood. But the frontier was a place where shadows held more than darkness. And one shadow, fueled by whiskey and a cruel curiosity, was already watching the lone cabin on the meadow. A man named Jeb, a drifter who'd heard the town talk about Caleb's blind bargain, saw not a person, but a vulnerability. He watched from the tree line as Caleb left for the high pasture at first light, leaving Ilara alone with the children. He waited, a hungry smile on his face, believing the stories that a woman who couldn't see was a woman who couldn't fight back. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside that quiet cabin. Jeb didn't bother knocking. He just pushed the door open, the wood groaning against his weight. The children froze. Ilara, standing at the table kneading bread, went still. "Well, look here," Jeb slurred, his voice thick with drink. "A whole litter and a blind mama hen. Where's your shepherd, little hen?" "Out in the fields." Ilara didn't answer. She turned her head slightly, her ears mapping the room, the rasp of his breath by the door, the scuffle of Jacob's feet shifting to stand in front of Ruth, the smell of unwashed wool and sour whiskey. "Children," she said, her voice remarkably calm, "go to the loft, now." "They'll stay put," Jeb said, taking a step inside. "I'm just paying a friendly visit. Heard a lot about you. The blind wife bought for a song." He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Thought I'd see what $2 actually buys a man." Ruth whimpered. That small sound seemed to snap something in Jacob. "You get out," the boy shouted, his voice cracking with fear and fury. Jeb ignored him, his focus on Ilara. He took another step, his boot heavy on the plank floor. Ilara's hands, covered in flour, pressed flat on the table. She had no weapon. She couldn't see to run, but she knew this cabin. She knew every inch of it in the dark, which for her was all the time. "Mister," she said, her voice low, "you're standing on the loose board, the one that tips to the right." Jeb looked down, confused. "What?" "It tips," she repeated, and as if on cue, his weight shifted, and the old board did indeed tilt with a loud creak, making him stumble sideways. It was a small thing, but it broke his momentum. It made him seem foolish, unbalanced in more ways than one. He swore, righting himself. His playfulness vanished, replaced by a meaner glare. "Clever," he growled. He lunged forward, not for her, but for the sack of flour on the table, intending to swipe it to the floor. He never reached it. Samuel, silent and swift, darted from the corner and brought the heavy iron poker down on Jeb's outstretched wrist. The man howled in pain, clutching his arm. In that second of distraction, Ilara acted. She didn't move toward him. She moved away to the hearth, her hand finding the handle of the kettle hanging over the low fire. It wasn't boiling, but it was hot. "The next sound I hear near my children," she said, holding the kettle out, steam rising from its spout, "will be followed by a scream that isn't mine. You understand me?" Jeb stared, cradling his wrist, at the blind woman holding a scalding weapon with terrifying accuracy aimed at the sound of his voice. His bravado evaporated. This wasn't a helpless invalid. This was a mother wolf in a den. He backed toward the door, fear and fury warring in his eyes. "This ain't over," he spat. "Yes, it is," said a new voice from the doorway. Caleb stood there, framed by the daylight, a shearing knife in his hand. He wasn't breathing hard, but his eyes were like stone. He had heard the commotion from the yard. Jeb's face went pale. Caleb didn't enter. He simply stepped aside. "Walk," he said. The single word held more violence than a shout. Jeb scrambled out, past Caleb, and ran for the tree line. Caleb watched him go, then turned to the cabin. His gaze swept over his children, huddled together but unharmed, then landed on Elara, still holding the kettle, her knuckles white. She slowly lowered it, setting it back on the hearth with a soft clang. The tremor in her hands started then. No one spoke. Caleb walked to her. He didn't touch her. He looked at the flower on her hands, at her sightless, wide eyes staring past his shoulder. "Did he hurt you?" His voice was rough. She shook her head. "No, the children, Samuel, he." "I saw." Caleb turned to his son. Samuel was shaking, the poker still in his hand. Caleb walked over and gently took it from him. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder, a firm, solid weight. "You protected your family," that was all, but Samuel stood a little taller. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb found Elara on the porch. She was hugging herself against the chill. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "I'm not," she replied. "You're here." He leaned against the post beside her. The silence between them was different now, charged with the adrenaline of the day, but also something softer. "You knew about the board," he said finally. "I hear it creak every morning when Jacob fetches the water. I know which way it tilts." "You aimed that kettle right at him." "I aimed it at his voice." She turned her face toward him. "Caleb, what I am, a wife you bought at auction, a servant, what am I in this house?" He was quiet for a long time. "You're the woman who stood between a drunk and my children," he said at last. "You're the one who knows this house better in the dark than I do in the light. You're Elara." He said her name like it was a full answer. "And I'm sorry I ever made you feel like you were anything less." It was the closest to a declaration either had made. The rope halter remained on the shelf, forgotten. A new bond, forged in crisis, had taken its place. But the frontier saves its hardest tests for when you think you've finally found solid ground. The rain didn't come that spring. Week after week, the sky stayed a relentless pale blue. The creek behind the barn shrank to a muddy trickle. The earth cracked. The garden Elara had started with such care, her hands learning the shape of each seed, each plant by leaf and stem, began to wither. The corn stalks curled in on themselves. The bean vines turned to brown threads. Caleb worked himself to exhaustion, digging a deeper well, driving the sheep farther each day to find scant grass. He came home each night with dust in the lines of his face and a deeper silence in his soul. The specter of failure, of not being able to provide, haunted him more fiercely than any drifter. Then the fever returned, not to the children but to him. One morning he simply didn't rise from his bed. Elara found him burning up, his skin dry as parchment, muttering in his sleep. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped her. This was his wife's story. This was how Sarah had begun to slip away. She mobilized the household with a quiet command. "Jacob, fetch cool water from the deepest part of the well. Samuel, tear the cleanest strips from the old sheet. Ruth, bring me the mint and the last of the honey." She became a general in a war against death. She wiped his brow, spooned water and bitter tea between his cracked lips, and sang the same lullabies she'd used on Samuel. The children watched, their world narrowing to the dark bedroom and the sound of their father's ragged breathing. Their dependence on Elara became absolute. She was the only pillar left standing. Near midnight, in the depth of the fever, Caleb stirred. His eyes opened, but they didn't see the room. He saw a ghost. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice broken, "don't go, not again." His hand flailed, seeking something that wasn't there. Elara caught his searching hand. She held it tight between both of hers. "I'm not Sarah," she said firmly, leaning close so her voice was all he could hear. "I'm Elara, and I'm not going anywhere. You hear me, Caleb Thatcher? I am staying right here." He blinked, the haze in his eyes clearing for a moment. He focused on her face, on her sightless, determined eyes. He didn't speak. He just held onto her hand as if it were a rope thrown into a stormy sea, and finally he slept. The fever broke by morning. Weak, gaunt, but alive, Caleb awoke to find Ilara asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on the mattress next to his hand, which she still held. He didn't pull away. He watched her, this woman who had pulled him back from the edge, and something in his heart, long frozen by grief and hardship, finally completely thawed. A few days later, as he sat weakly on the porch, Ruth came running, her voice a bright shriek. "Mama, Mama, Ilara, come quick." Ilara, helping Caleb with a cup of broth, stood. Ruth grabbed her hand and pulled her to the garden, to the patch of dry, cracked earth she had refused to abandon. There, nestled at the base of a withered-looking vine, was a single, perfect cucumber. Its skin was a deep, impossible green. It was alive. It had grown without rain, in earth everyone said was dead. Caleb shuffled over, leaning on a stick. He looked from the cucumber to Ilara's dirt-stained hands, to her face, which was turned toward the warmth of the sun on the green leaves. "How?" was all he could ask. A smile touched her lips. "You don't need eyes to feel life wanting to grow," she said softly. "You just need to believe it can." He reached out then, not for the vegetable, but for her. His hand, still weak, cupped her cheek. He turned her face toward his. He didn't ask permission. He didn't speak. He simply bent and kissed her there in the dust of the dying garden beside the one thing that had lived. It was a kiss of gratitude, of wonder, of a choice finally made clear. She kissed him back, and in that moment the $2 auction, the halter, the blindness, the drought, all of it fell away. What remained was simply a man, a woman, and a choice to grow something together in hard ground. But the outside world was not done with them. The drought that tested them was about to bring a new, more formidable threat to their door. Not a drunken drifter, but men in clean suits, carrying maps and legal papers, who saw their hard-won home not as a refuge, but as a line on a survey to be crossed, and they were not asking. They arrived in a polished buggy, a cloud of dust trailing them like a banner. Two men in city suits, their faces pale against the brown prairie. They called themselves right-of-way agents for the Great Western Railroad. They found Caleb mending a fence, Ilara beside him handing him nails. "Mr. Thatcher," the taller one said, tipping his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we'd like to make you a rich man." Inside the cabin, they spread a map across the rough-hewn table. A thick, red line sliced straight through the valley, through the barn, through the garden, through the heart of the homestead. "The survey is complete," the agent explained. "The route is optimal. The company is prepared to offer you a generous sum for your land, enough to buy a finer place elsewhere with modern conveniences, a fresh start." Caleb said nothing. He looked at the red line. He looked out the window at the garden where a single cucumber had become a dozen, where beans now climbed strings Ilara had tied between posts. He looked at the oak tree where he'd hung a swing for Ruth. He looked at Ilara, who stood listening by the hearth, her head tilted as if she could see the map, see the line dividing their world. "And if we say no?" Caleb asked, his voice quiet. The second agent, younger, shifted. "The rail is coming, sir. It's progress. It's the future. You can't stop it. This way, you're compensated. The other way, well, the courts have ways of handling eminent domain. It gets messy. We'd rather you were happy." Ilara spoke then, her voice clear in the quiet room. "This land is not just dirt." The agents turned, surprised by the blind woman's intervention. "Ma'am, you smell of coal smoke and cheap paper," she said. "I smell the pine resin Caleb uses on the fence posts. I hear the well rope groan, the same sound it made the night I pulled water for his fever. This land has his sweat in it. It has my children's laughter buried in it. You cannot buy that with any sum on your map." The older agent's polite mask slipped for a second. "With respect, ma'am, the law doesn't account for sentiment." Caleb stood up. The chair scraped loud on the floor. "It should," he said. He walked to the door and held it open. "The answer is no. You can turn your train, or you can go through someone else's hill." The men packed their map, their frustration poorly concealed. As the buggy pulled away, Jacob, who had been listening from the loft, came down. "Pa, can they do that? Take our land?" Caleb watched the dust settle. "Not today," he said, but the worry had entered the house, colder than any winter draft. That evening, Caleb and Ilara sat on the porch as the stars emerged. "They'll be back," she said, "with papers, with a judge." "I know," Caleb replied. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "When I bought you, it was a transaction. I needed help, you needed shelter. But this," he gestured to the land, the cabin, the garden glowing silver in the moonlight. "This is a choice, my choice, our choice, and I'll be damned if I let a man with a map tell me it doesn't count." The next morning, he went to the barn and returned with a long, weathered plank of cedar. He set it on 2 sawhorses. He brought out a mallet and a set of wood-burning irons he'd heated in the forge. "What are you making?" Ilara asked. "Our answer," he said. He worked all day. The children gathered, watching as he carefully burned letters into the wood, the smoke carrying the scent of cedar into the air. He didn't let them see the words until he was done. In the late afternoon, he shouldered the sign and a post. Ilara walked beside him, her hand on his arm. They walked to the very edge of their property, where the main trail passed by. Caleb dug a hole, set the post, and pounded it deep into the hard earth. Then he lifted the sign and nailed it firmly to the post. He stepped back. On the sign, burned deep and clear, were 2 words, "Not for sale." Ilara reached out, her fingers tracing the grooves of the letters. She smiled. "They'll see it." "That's the point," Caleb said. Word traveled. The railroad men did come back with a county clerk and a formal offer. They pointed to the sign from their buggy. The clerk shrugged. The man's made his position clear. The agents argued about law, about progress, about the greater good, but they left without setting foot past the fence line. Something about the defiant simplicity of that sign, planted in the dust by a shepherd and his blind wife, made the legal maneuvering feel shallow, cruel. The railroad, in the end, curved around the ridge. It was cheaper than the fight. Life, real life, settled in. The children grew. Jacob, at 16, took over more of the flock. Samuel showed a knack for mechanics, fixing anything with a moving part. The twins, Benjamin and Joseph, were forces of nature, inseparable. Ruth grew into a young woman with her mother's gentle strength and her father's steady gaze. One by one, they courted, married, and built homes of their own on adjacent land or in town. But the original cabin never emptied. It filled with grandchildren. Ilara's garden became legendary. It grew in wild, generous profusion. She planted by touch and smell, companioning flowers with vegetables, herbs with fruit trees. People from town would come, seeking remedies for ailments, but also just to see the blind garden that flourished where nothing else should. She always sent them home with a sprig of mint, a handful of beans, and a quiet word of encouragement. Years turned like pages. One autumn afternoon, Caleb found Ilara sitting on her favorite bench beneath the oak, her face turned to the weak sun. He sat beside her, his own bones stiff. A grandson, little Eli, played in the fallen leaves nearby. "Grandpa," the boy asked, pointing to the arch over the garden gate. "What do those words say?" Caleb looked up. Years ago, he had carved a new sign for the arch. He never explained it to anyone. The boy couldn't read it yet. Caleb's voice was rough with age. "It says, 'She did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life.'" The boy frowned, not understanding. "Who?" Caleb took Ilara's hand, her fingers now thin and lined, but still sure in his. "Your grandmother." Ilara passed away in her sleep on a cold winter night, with Caleb beside her. They buried her under the old oak, in the garden she had brought to life. Caleb carved her headstone himself from a piece of native stone. It read, "Here grew everything she was never given, and all that she gave anyway." After that, Caleb spent his days on the porch or sitting by her grave. He talked to her as if she could hear. He told her about the new lambs, about Ruth's new baby, about the stubborn rose bush that was blooming out of season. His children and grandchildren cared for him, but a part of him had gone with her. He died the following spring, on a morning full of birdsong. They buried him beside her. At the joint funeral, the minister told the story not of a wife's sale, but of a love that had built a world where none was intended. The sign at the edge of the property, faded but still legible, remained, "Not for sale." And the garden, it did something remarkable. It didn't die, it naturalized. The seeds from that year and every year before fell and took root. Mint spread along the path. Tomatoes volunteered near the fence. Sunflowers rose tall without anyone planting them. It became a persistent, beautiful memorial, thriving on its own, a testament to a love that had permanently enriched the soil. Years later, decades later, the railroad was abandoned for a newer line. The town of Dust Bend dwindled, but travelers on the old road would still slow their cars or their horses when they passed the Thatcher place. The cabin was weathered, the fence sagging, but the sign was still there. And if they looked past it, they would see, against all odds, a splash of wild color, a garden still growing, untended but abundant, a promise kept by the very earth. The story of the blind woman bought for $2 and the shepherd who saw her value became local legend, then folklore. It was a story told not of pity, but of power, the power of a second look, the power of a choice, the power of hands that could heal not because of sight, but because of love. It all started with a question in a dusty square. What's wrong with her? The answer, it turned out, was absolutely nothing, and that changed everything. So what are we to make of this story, of Caleb and Ilara? On one level, it's a single, quiet tale from a hard time, now woven into the dust of history. But on another, it asks a question that echoes far beyond that frontier town. What do we do with the people the world has labeled worthless? The practice of wife selling was a brutal economic transaction, a symptom of a time when women and those with disabilities had little legal standing. It reduced human beings to their immediate utility. Caleb entered that square expecting to participate in that same brutal calculus. He was looking for help, for labor, but he saw something else. He saw a person where others saw a defect. And that second look, that moment of unexpected grace, changed the trajectory of every life in that cabin. Ilara did not heal his children's grief with a miracle. She healed it with presence, with patience, with hands that learned a home by touch and a heart that refused to be defined by what she lacked. Her gift wasn't supernatural sight, it was profound attention. She listened to the land until it yielded food. She listened to the children until they felt seen. She listened to a broken man until he remembered how to love. Their story tells us that the most transformative forces are often the most quiet. Not grand gestures, but daily choices. Not a love that demands perfection, but a love that accepts what is and nurtures what could be. The garden that grew against the drought is the perfect metaphor. Life, stubborn and beautiful, persists in the cracks if someone is willing to believe in it. That sign, not for sale, stood for more than land. It was a declaration of value. It said some things are not commodities. Some bonds, forged in choice and loyalty, are beyond price. The railroad moved on. The agents forgot, but the garden remembers. We live in a different world now, but the central challenge remains. We still make quick judgments. We still prioritize utility over humanity. We still overlook quiet strength in a noisy world. The story of the $2 wife and the shepherd asks us to pause, to look twice, to consider what and who we might be discounting. Perhaps the true measure of a civilization is not how it treats its strongest, but what it makes room for in its weakest. Caleb and Ilara built a world in a forgotten valley. They built it from scratch, from dust and determination, and in doing so, they left behind a legend more nourishing than any fortune. That legend, like those tenacious seeds, is still growing. It's here in this story. It asks you a simple question: what are you planting in the ground beneath your feet and in the lives around you? If you found meaning in this forgotten history, consider subscribing for more journeys into the past, where the smallest choices changed everything. Thank you for listening.